Hi there, so we are going to work on our watercolor techniques today. So you're going to notice that it's on a separate sheet of paper than that's in your notebook because if you paint on that regular printer paper, it's going to warp a lot. This is cardstock and not watercolor paper. I can't print on the watercolor paper, so it's going to act a little bit different than the regular watercolor paper. Regular watercolor paper is going to let you use a little bit more of the water. It won't absorb as fast as this does. So that's going to come into play in a couple of different areas when you are doing this, especially like the blotting. So I'm going to show you some of the techniques that you can use for your watercolor. You're going to need to grab from the back of the classroom a water cup, a paintbrush, paint palette, and a paper towel. So once you have all of those things ready to go, you can get started. So for a wash, which is the most simple of of techniques, you're going to get your paintbrush wet, pick whichever color you'd like, put some water in there. You might need to dip it more than once just to get the paint started. And you want it to be a thin layer. You do not want it to be too thick, meaning too dark. So more water on a wash level is better. Now when you use regular watercolor paper, it won't absorb as fast, so you'll have time to kind of spread the paint out. Because this is cardstock, it's going to absorb really, really quickly. So you want to work in thin layers. So it doesn't need to look perfect, but just kind of practice using that technique of just putting a wash down. You're actually going to do the same thing on the wet on dry and just put a wash down because we need to let it dry before we move on to the next step for that one. So put a wash down. Now when you're painting with watercolor, the more water, the lighter the color. Less water, the darker the color. So start there. So I have a wash on this one and on this one as well. Now for blotting, it's not going to really work on this cardstock paper, but I will show you what it looks like on regular watercolor paper. So this is my regular watercolor paper, and it gets this really nice textured look on your paper. So essentially what you do is you put a wash down, pick a different color, just spice it up. And while it is still wet, you take your paper towel and you dab it. Like I said, doesn't really work very well on this paper, but I'll show you on here. Oops, yeah, I'm just dripping. So I put the wash down, and I might want to take my paper towel and lift some of that color up. Creates a textured look, and it also helps get rid of the colors too, so you don't want a color so bright on it. Surface, you can use that technique. So give that a shot in there. You're not really going to see it on your paper, which is fine, but just practice using that technique. For dry brush, what you are going to do is dry your brush off as much as you can. You don't want a whole lot of water on your brush. And you're going to use a color that maybe you have already used just because there's a little bit of water in there. And getting this consistency is a little bit tricky. You don't want it super watery. So I can tell by just dipping it in the green where I had it, it's already too wet, so I might want to absorb some of that water with my paintbrush. Yep, still too wet. So getting that consistency right is tricky, and it's going to look kind of streaky with your brush strokes. You should see like the little individual hairs in there. This is good at creating texture, so I'm trying to get it where it's nice and dry in the paint. Maybe dab off some more of that water. And it's a real streaky kind of look. Depending on your paintbrush too, you can use the bristles of the brush to kind of work in your favor. And try getting that consistency down on this. So really good for textures. For crayon resist, you might remember doing something like this in elementary school, where you used a crayon or an oil pastel. I'm going to use an oil pastel, and you might remember doing something with like a secret message, and you write it down, and then when you put the watercolor paint on top, it appears. Now the reason this works is because these are, if they're oil based or wax based, like a crayon would be wax based, where oil pastels obviously have oil in them. Water and oil do not mix together. So when you draw something with oil and you place something with water, it repels it, it pushes it away. So when you do this, you want to make sure that you're using a heavy pressure, so that way your oil pastel is thick, to give it some more resistance. So you can, if you want to do the secret message thing, you use a white, but you can use any color. And using a nice thin layer of paints. Remember, you want to try to add more watery layers. You can always build up, but you can't always take away. So a nice watery layer you're going to place on top, and you're going to notice your message will start to come through. This one's my favorite. I think it's the most fun. And there it is. We're going to skip wet on dry. We're still waiting for that one to dry, and we're going to go to wet on wet. Wet on wet. Like I said before, kind of this paper is super absorbent, so it doesn't work as well as it does on the watercolor paper, which you will be using for your finals, just not for this practice sheet. So you're actually going to paint a clear layer just with water first. And you want to kind of saturate this paper just because it is super absorbent. Your paper might warp a little too. That's okay. So I'm putting a layer of water on that rectangle. And then when I dip into my paint and I touch the water, you're going to notice it's going to spread really quickly. The more water you have, the quicker it's going to spread. So this is a cool technique. It's kind of tie-dye-ish. If you're noticing, it's not spreading any more water, so you can go in and add more water, and you can kind of try to control it, but it is very hard to control this technique. But it is super duper fun. So give it a shot. Okay, so for a gradient, we want to fade one color into another color. So it has to be a color that is similar on the color wheel. So if you were thinking about the color wheel, colors that are next to each other are perfect for this. I would just skip using brown and black for this, but in here you can use any two colors that are next to each other. So I like doing the blue into the green. I think that's pretty. So I'm going to start with a dark value. So that means less water. And as I go towards the middle, I want to add water to it to kind of lighten it. And I can pull the pigment or the color from the darker area into the lighter area. And I'm going to do the other direction with the green. And where they meet in the middle, I want to start to try to blend them into each other. So this is a good technique or good practice for kind of creating that gradient. You can always go back in and add more of the pigment to it to get it darker, but you can't really take it away very much, so it's better to go lighter. And we want to see a nice gradient from one color into the next. You shouldn't be able to see where the blue starts and the green stops, or vice versa. The next one is a value scale. So you're just going to practice kind of what you already did, but just creating from dark to light. So I'm going to do red for this one, and less water, darker the pigment. And I'm going to practice kind of doing that pulling. So, pull some more. blending so it's not really hard edges. And keep pulling. Go back and add some more. Now we're going to go back to this wet on dry. So a lot of times you're going to have to do this technique where you let a layer dry, then put another layer on, and then so on and so forth. And you can, the reason you have to do this is so that way your colors don't all just get all mixed together like it would on wet on wet. So if you want to add a new layer, you can go ahead and do that once one layer dries. So this is probably one of the more common ones that you're going to have to use. And it happens relatively fast, but say I were to want to add leaves on this, if I were to go and paint the green on it right away, it's going to mix with that brown, so I might not want that. You might want to have a little bit of mixing going on, but not too much. So just keep that in mind. So you're going to notice that it'll sit on top. Kind of show you, maybe if I did some red leaves on there, you might get some mixing in there that you might not want, or you might want it. It depends. So it's best to layer with the watercolor. So start light, and then you can go back and over your lines. So that is all you have to do for today. When you are done, please make sure that you return everything where you got it. Water cups go back in the sink, and artworks go on the drying rack.